Well, we're here at St Vincent's, and it's my great honour that we've got extended BJ Miller's discussion with our staff this morning to have an interview. And this is BJ Miller, after suffering a horrific accident 28 years ago as a youth, has changed his life and has become a palliative care physician, but more dedicating his life to accompany patients along their journey, to ease patients' suffering. So we're thrilled to have you here at St Vincent's, BJ. First question would have to be, how does your mother come up with the name BJ? It's all through my perspective, but BJ is not a common name in Australia.
No.
How does BJ come about?
Well, my name is, BJ stands for Bruce Jr.
Right.
And I think Bruce is a pretty common name in Australia.
My brother is Bruce.
Oh, well, so there you go. But it was common enough that my dad was also named Bruce. So because Dad was named Bruce, they had to call me something else to avoid confusion. And at the time of when I was born, the song Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head, it was BJ Thomas. And so that prompted her to say, oh, BJ, that sounds nice, Bruce Jr. And that was that.
Right.
So,
thank you. That's a bit random, that question. But
yeah, an easy one to answer.
I guess we're, you know, you could think about the accident, but who's inspired you along your journey?
Well, that's another easy question. I mean, we've already talked about my mother. It would be, so my mom had polio as an infant, and then has since developed post-polio syndrome, and pretty significant disability because of it all. So in the early 1980s, she had polio and it settled in her right leg, and for much of my childhood she just wore a brace and walked on crutches and was very active. Then post-polio syndrome set in, and it was very aggressive in a lot of ways, and bit by bit she's become more and more dependent on her wheelchair, etc. So I've watched her navigate disability, and I learned from her, I think early as a child, being tuned into my mom, watching how she functioned in the world and watching how the world treated her through this lens of disability was a huge lesson for me. And she really taught me that disability, you know, everything we're talking about here, to see it as a part of a normal life, one way or another. That our bodies are never always doing what we want them to do, and that there's a great commonality in disability. And that becoming disabled didn't mean you were less of a person. It just ramped up this interdependence that we all feel anyway. So she helped me couch and contextualize what it meant to be disabled. And so when I was 19 and then became disabled myself, I had a real running start. You know, I think a lot of my peers in rehab, you know, they had parents who couldn't, you know, a dad who couldn't look at them because they couldn't play football anymore, or, you know, there was all this shame around it. And I watched my peers suffer unnecessarily for a few years before they regained some confidence and insistence upon themselves as a viable, active, you know, full human being. I got to go right. I didn't have to hate myself for a few years to get there. And that's all thanks to my mom. So
through her suffering, gave you an ability, she gave you a gift that she didn't know she was giving you along that journey.
Absolutely she did.
One of the things that you talk about is the reality, seeing the reality, and we often are hoping for a different reality, and accompany the people along that journey of loss. How do you pace loss? How do you adjust to loss? And how do you sometimes not cause offence to people? Because hope is part of certainly our beliefs of faith. Of course. There's always hope.
Of course.
So how do you adjust to reality?
It's a really good question, and it's so dynamic. I think part of that is opening our eyes and being aware of losses that are happening all the time. Right? So my losses of limbs is just very dramatic, it's very obvious. But the truth is, when I think about how I felt about losing limbs, it wasn't terrifically different from how I felt about losing my car keys, or, you know, or a girlfriend, or whatever. That every day was filled with either my own losses or others that I knew. One way or another, it's happening all around us all the time. So I guess part of it is to encourage ourselves to acknowledge that, to open our eyes and see a world that includes loss all the time. And if you start roping that into that reality, then the next loss comes, perhaps you don't feel so, it's not like you go from everything's great to everything's horrible. You're just kind of moving in between this great spectrum of loss and gain all the time. So part of that, so I think part of the answer is to crafting a worldview where you get to see loss, where you see it all around us, so you have a relationship with it. And then the second, I think, which takes time, and as clinicians, I can't force a patient to do this. This is where part of your question gets really important. We can't mandate someone learn from their losses. But if we don't run away from people, if we stick with people, and by sticking with people, we show love. We show that there's still a place for them in the world. And we allow them to go through the grieving process and the healing process. And we may grieve with them as our clinicians. And in so doing, we've beat back any shame that goes with the loss. We've also allowed room for lessons to be learned, for a sense of gain. So, you know, if a doctor had told me weeks after losing my limbs, hey, it's not a loss, it's a gain. You're going to gain all this perspective, and I would have punched him. Yeah, exactly. I would have said, yeah, you know, thanks, get out of my room. So it's not that we have to be very careful with that. But that was a true, if that someone had said that, that would have been a true statement, because eventually it did feel very much like a gain. It helped me see the world in a fuller way. It helped me realize my dependency on other people in a really full way, and allowed me to see beauty in that. But that takes time. And so our job is not so much to mandate that someone learn something or get over it. No, our job is really to hold that space that includes loss and make that as normal as can be, so that the person can navigate that experience and move from loss to the gains that come too. And I think another piece of that puzzle is for all of us engaged in this work to see ourselves, to be in touch with our own losses. Not anyone engaged in this work is without loss. So we all should have some relationship to that. And by then we're a little bit more comfortable with each other amidst the loss. Then we don't run away from suffering. We see it, we acknowledge it, it's familiar to us. And this way allows us to stick with people over time and not run away from them.
That's a very clear message about not throwing away, not running away from the problem, but accompanying it and acknowledging it.
That's
and seeing it for what it is.
That's right.
Rather than trying to solve everything.
That's right. Yeah.
One of the things at St Vincent's is, like any organisation, we love to build something new, a new wing, and we've got aspirations for another tower. What in our planning, what should we be thinking about for those for patients? What are the things that we should be thinking about? I know you talk about Florence Nightingale, but what do you think we should be thinking about in terms of our planning and our thinking about our patients?
That is a wonderful question. And thank you for thinking about this prospectively before that new tower is built. My home institution, University of California, UCSF, they just built 40-acre new campus in the city of San Francisco. And what an amazing, every couple generations you get a chance to do that. I was also ended up left feeling very, very disappointed, because in the end, it could have been so much more than it was. And so there's a real opportunity in your question. And again, if we're thinking about well-being and health and illness as experiences, as something we move through together over time rather than a transaction moment, that invites architects and interior designers into this mix, all the things that condition environment. So your question makes me very optimistic, just the fact that you're asking it before this happens. So another answer to, or an actual answer to your question, though, would be to involve patients and families one way or another in that process. It's amazing. There are a lot of, so in the States, the rhetoric around patient-centered care, person-centered care is gaining some traction. People really say it and mean it. But at the same time, and I'm guilty of it too, I'll go to meetings about patient-centric care of some kind or another, and there's no patient in the room. We talk on behalf of the patient, and that seems to be enough. Like, oh, well, we're thinking about the patient when we design the building. Well, I would push you to take another step and find a way to involve actual patients, or yourself, or get in a gurney, get in a wheelchair, and move through the building and feel what that is like, from the parking lot through the cafeteria and the bathrooms and the clinical exam rooms. there is a gnarly tradition. If you look at a lot of old health institutions in the States, you'll find a lot of clinical exam rooms that are inaccessible to people in wheelchairs. What the heck? Like, that is the most absurd thing imaginable. Yeah. So anyway, a lot could be done if you just got yourself in a chair or in a gurney and just moved through it and see how it felt. You could, that would go a long way. But the bottom line is involve the patients and families in the design brief.
Thank you, thank you. One of the, I'm not too sure across the world, but in Victoria there is new legislation coming in about voluntary assisted dying. As a Catholic institution, this is concerning for us. Accompanying patients is part of who we are, and the holistic care, both emotional and spiritual and physical. Yeah. But it is a trend across the world, I think, that choice. What are your thoughts about that? And I guess in some respects, it's why do you think it's such a big anxiety?
So, I can just speak from my own experience, and actually, in California, it became, this is a state by state in the U.S., and California made assisted dying legal. I think it was 2016, and then just a month or two ago, so that was beginning to happen in the state. It was rolling out, and everyone was kind of trying to feel their way with the law. And just maybe a month or two ago, a court struck it down, revoked the law based on a technicality, and all of a sudden it was illegal again. Okay. And then a week or two ago, there was an injunction to reinstate the law. So it's been, I say all that just to say it's really cumbersome and clunky process, as of course it is. The idea of moving from salvaging, saving a life at all costs, which in that statement has some beauty in it, to default to saving a life, keeping somebody's body alive as a default move makes a lot of sense. As it does too that at some point death is inevitable, and that we shouldn't somehow, if we send signals that it's an aberrancy, that it's an anomaly, we are setting ourselves up and our patients up to feel like they're failing if they die. And that is a crime of its own kind, so that we feel ashamed of ourselves for doing something entirely natural. So part of, I think, the answer to the question is for all of us to have a more mature conversation about what death really means to us, and its role in our lives, and its insistence in life. And if we, so that's part of the answer to the question. It's part of it's on all of us as a society, as health systems, to reframe how we see this subject. Okay, that's a big, big point. Another point would be, is to see, when, at least in the States, what I think our public are telling us is that, I think what's behind this law is really people saying, hey, this is my body. And very often you hand yourself over to a health system. As a sick person, you're feeling so lousy, you want your doctor to know things, you just kind of hand yourself over. And that's not been such a great way to go. So I think what's behind so much of the momentum of the law is really people saying, hey, this is my life, and sort of demanding to have that, to feel that, and that respect. And another is a little bit of a message, I think, to our health system to say, hey, you doctors, you don't know everything. You don't have all the answers. You can't make everything better. Sometimes you talk like you do, but the truth is you don't. So I think part of the signal we need to absorb here is what the public are symbolically telling us through this law. So I think if we acknowledge those things, we might, in a way, obviate the need for the law. So, I think of it in practical terms. In the States, very few people invoke the law. Very few. And in Oregon, 0.4% of people, 0.4% of the deaths per year. A very small number, practically speaking. But the subject is huge symbolically for all these reasons. And it really gets at who we are as people and who we are as physicians and as a health system. So anyway, part of it, I think the trick is seeing all these signals for what they are. And acknowledging the truth too that a lot of people who will go through the process and get the medication to hasten their death don't ever end up using it. So what the therapy in it is that they have some way out, even if they never use it, to feel that way out. So if we can send signals to ourselves and to the public that we're going to be there no matter what happens, that we're going to tend to their suffering no matter what, that too will obviate the need for the law. And finally, of course, is a matter of respect. It's so important that systems and individuals be able to opt out of this. It is a huge thing to ask someone to help you die. To help someone end their lives is an enormous undertaking. And that needs all the respect and deference it's due. So as a physician, if I'm opposed in any way, I have to be honest with that. And within a state now that it's legal again, I also have a duty to say to my patient, I can't be that for you, but let me help you find someone who might be able to. And then finally, let me say too, that I think back to the signals we're absorbing is that people, very often it's a cry for help. So when a patient approaches me with some sort of, say, wanting to hasten their death, that is a conversation starter. And usually, very often, they may be testing me to see how I feel about that. If someone says, hey doc, you know, I've had enough of this life. I'm thinking about getting off the planet, you know, could you help me? And I'm like, oh sure, you know, I'm happy to. That sends a signal to them like, oh geez, that was a little quick. You know, maybe we want to talk about this. You know, so on some level it's a test, I think. Doc, are you really with me? How far are you willing to go with me? And then finally, I think it's oftentimes you have to find out what's behind the request. Sometimes it's like they feel they're going to be a burden, right? That's a big driver. People often say, I don't want to be a burden to my family, a burden to society. Well, that's an indictment of us as a society. We're making people feel like a burden for being disabled, being a burden for being sick, for being a burden for dying. That's on all of us. That's a real indictment of the society we've crafted, that we've alienated people in the lurch. So I really think that we need to see, I think in short, we need to look at what's behind this request to hasten death. Is it untreated pain, untreated depression? You know, and a final comment, we could talk for so long about this, but
it's fantastic to hear your thoughts.
Well, it's just, there's so much wrapped into it. So no matter what I feel as an individual about the law, I feel like I wish the law were put forth with some measures to develop and to provide access to palliative care. Because if what we're saying to people, if we can sanction someone's death because their suffering is so intractable, and we say, oh, well, you're so miserable, so therefore we'll help you die. If we go right to that without doing all we can to help each other not suffer so much, that seems really a little bit too convenient again. So so from a policy point of view, entertaining laws like this I would love to have them come with as a package deal of developing palliative care services, so we have other ways to help people not suffer so much, again, which would probably obviate the request to hasten their death in the first place. Those two things need to be linked. It's way too expedient to say, sure, we'll get you off the planet, and we haven't done everything we already know how to do to not suffer so much.
Thank you, Vijay. The last question from a patient I think you had the room and you asked the question about do you want to live forever? And there was no hands that went up.
Not a one?
Not one that went up.
Yeah.
But I guess palliative care is the acknowledgement that we're all going to die. But what activities would you recommend for someone that is, I guess we say, in palliative care? How would they help to enjoy their life to the full?
For the patient's point of view?
Yeah.
Well, that's a big good question, and this is where, you know, part of my comment is for us as in the healthcare world to be agents also for finding wonder and awe and joy in life, because as our bodies invariably crumble and our minds too, which they will do, that doesn't mean that all is lost. I've worked with so many patients who, because they could no longer do X, Y, or Z job, or no longer felt they could take that role with their family of being the patriarch or the matriarch or whatever it is, it's like you take away that role and it's just this very steep fall. So part of it is that we should get really good and very agile together at repurposing ourselves. Just because we lost our major thrust that got us through the last 40 years doesn't mean that there's not some new creative enterprise around the corner waiting for us, some new access to meaning, some new access to purpose. I mean, I would think about, part of what's so tragic about, at least in the States, about some of the nursing home situation where people are truly warehoused. I mean, you can dress up the foyer and stuff, but really very often is a warehousing phenomenon. And you think about all the wisdom that is just going unrecognized in nursing home hallways, where we don't respect our elders, where we aren't able to see past physical ailments. That's a shame. We're really undermining ourselves as a society. So I think if we find a way to repurpose ourselves, people, bringing school kids into nursing homes, talking with their elders is another way to kind of bridge some of these gaps. That's a powerful force for someone to keep living until they really have to die. Right. So repurposing, yes. And roping, making sure the fabric, the infrastructure of society has a way for us for disabled people to be in it, for sick people to be in it, so they're not out of view. So that will normalize things. That will help me as a person who's dying to feel like I still belong in this world. Very often people are ready to die that I meet, or they're ready to die because the world doesn't feel made for them anymore. They don't feel part of it anymore. That's, again, an indictment on all of us who craft society. And then my last point would be is this aesthetic point. Like, there's a life beyond our intellect. There's a life beyond our roles. There's a life of just feeling things. Music, food, whatever it is. The material pleasures and challenges of a life are profound. And if you see life beyond the intellect, if you see the life of the senses of having value, you've just eked out another little range of life beyond the purpose, beyond our role playing. You've allowed for a beautiful access to beauty all the way until the end. And that can be a compelling life force of its own. So if our goal really is not to die, but to live until we die, these are the kinds of things we need to be working on. And by the way, that brings me back to your question about the new pavilion. Let us take beauty, think about in our daily lives, the role of feeling nature, the sun on the skin, maybe it's going to a museum, but the role of beauty in daily life is an inspiring force to feel part of that. And it's so sad that we choke people off from that beauty right when they're in most need for inspiration, right? So architecture and help in designing places where you want to be, where the feeling of being in a cathedral or a museum, an inspired space. Why don't our hospitals engage with this? There's real therapy to beauty.
Thank you. Well, it's been a great honour for me to have this chance, this one-on-one. A lot of our staff who couldn't get there this morning wanted to hear more, and some of these questions have come from them. And I know you have such great respect for healthcare and staff that work in this field, and you talked about the respect you have for nursing, which is a big part of our workforce. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here.